You've walked out of a conversation before, not understanding why you were exhausted. You've walked into a room and felt something was wrong without being able to name it. You've spent days carrying a weight that wasn't yours, not knowing where it came from, not being able to shake it. Most people chalk it up to stress, mood, sensitivity, but Itzhak Bentov spent years measuring exactly what happens in those moments. And what he found goes against everything you were taught about who you are and how reality works. You are being reprogrammed all the time, by the environment, by the people around you, by frequencies that enter your system without asking permission, and that your subconscious, loyal, and unfiltered treats as part of your identity. The most disturbing part isn't that this happens. The most disturbing part is that there is a precise mechanism to prevent it from happening, and nobody told you about it. Bentov discovered how the human energy field works, where it gets invaded, and more importantly, how to close it to frequencies that destroy and open it to frequencies that build. That knowledge is in this video, and if you stay until the end, you'll understand why your life has the patterns it has, and what to do to change that in a real way, without empty mysticism, without groundless promises. Itzhak Bentov didn't come to the study of consciousness through faith. He didn't come through religion, didn't arrive through a mystical childhood experience, or through a spiritual crisis that made him question everything. He came through science, through cold mathematics, through measuring instruments, through data that doesn't lie, and it was precisely because of that what he found along the way was so disturbing, because it couldn't be ignored, it couldn't be dismissed. It was real, it was measurable, and it directly contradicted what most people believe about themselves and about the reality they live in. Bentov was a biomedical engineer, a genuine inventor, the kind of person who spends the day solving problems with equations, not with intuitions. He created medical devices that were used in hospitals around the world. He had a mind that operated on concrete, verifiable, reproducible ground. And it was with that same mind that he decided to turn a scientific eye toward something conventional science preferred to ignore, human consciousness. Not as a philosophical concept, as a physical phenomenon, as something that can be observed, measured, and understood within the laws of physics. What he found in that investigation wasn't what you'd expect from an engineer. What he found was that the human being, at its most fundamental level, is a system of vibration. Not as a figure of speech, not as spiritual poetry, but as a biophysical fact. Every cell in the human body oscillates at specific frequencies. The heart pulses in rhythms that generate measurable electromagnetic fields. The brain produces waves that propagate beyond the skull, and all of those oscillations together form what Bentov called an energy field, a kind of vibrational signature that the human body emits all the time, 24 hours a day, sleeping or awake, conscious or not. This field is not inert. It interacts with the environment. It receives information. It transmits information. It responds to everything around it, other people, other fields, other environments. And the detail that changes absolutely everything in this equation is the following. This interaction happens before the conscious mind perceives it, before you think about something, before you form an opinion, before you decide how you feel about a given situation. Your field has already processed it, already responded, already been affected. The central problem Bentov identified is that nobody teaches this. School doesn't teach it, family doesn't teach it, culture doesn't teach it. People grow up not knowing they carry a living, responsive energy field around their bodies, not knowing that this field is porous, not knowing that it absorbs frequencies from the environment the way a fabric absorbs moisture. And without that knowledge, protection is impossible. Not because the person is weak or incapable, but simply because no one defends what they don't know needs defending. Bentov spent years documenting what happened with people who lived in states of high internal coherence, states where the body-mind system operated in sync, in order, in elevated frequency. And he documented equally what happened with people who lived in the opposite state, fragmented, reactive, exposed to low-frequency environments with no conscious protection whatsoever. The difference between those two groups wasn't genetic, wasn't spiritual in the religious sense of the word, wasn't luck. It was simply information. Whoever knew how the human energy field works could protect it. Whoever didn't know was swept away by the current without even realizing they were drowning. And it is exactly that point that makes Bentov's work so important even today. Perhaps more important than it was during his lifetime. The modern world bombards the human system with more low coherence frequencies than any period in history. Information arrives non-stop. Social interactions happen at unprecedented volume and speed. Environments of conflict and urgency have multiplied. And most people are navigating this ocean without any map, without any compass, without knowing that the boat has holes that can be sealed. What Bentov discovered is that sealing those holes doesn't require special talent, doesn't require years in a monastery, doesn't require a spiritual gift. It requires understanding how the field works, and understanding, specifically, where external energies enter, and how it's possible to stop them. But to understand that with the necessary depth, first, you need to see something that most people have never stopped to look at: the field itself. What you are before any thought, before any emotion, before any word. Most people spend their entire lives believing they end at their own skin, that the body is the boundary between what is theirs and what belongs to the world. That belief seems obvious. It even seems unnecessary to question it. After all, you can see where your body begins and where it ends, right? But it's exactly there, in that seemingly unshakable certainty, that the greatest blind spot of modern human experience lies. Because what physics already knows, and what Bentov's work, translated with uncommon clarity, is that the human body does not end where the skin ends. It never did. The electromagnetic field generated by the human heart extends several feet around the body. This is not esoteric speculation. It's something that can be measured with magnetometry equipment. The brain emits waves that propagate beyond the skull. Cells communicate through electrical and photonic signals that surpass physical membranes. The entire body is a simultaneous transmitter and receiver, operating at frequencies that conscious perception doesn't detect, but that the nervous system registers with absolute fidelity. And that field around the body is the first point of contact with everything that exists in the external environment, with people, with places, with situations, with the emotions circulating nearby. What this means in practice, in real life, in the day-to-day experience of any person, is something that completely changes the way one sees their own experience. Before an emotion becomes a conscious thought, before a thought consolidates into a belief, before a belief begins to shape behaviors, the information has already entered the field, already been processed at a level that the rational mind has no direct access to. The field receives first, consciousness perceives after, and in most cases too late to do anything about it. This explains something that almost everyone has lived through, but few have been able to name with precision. That feeling of walking into a room and sensing something is off, without being able to identify what. That immediate perception that a particular person drains your energy, even though they haven't said anything problematic, even though the conversation seemed apparently neutral. That strangeness after a day spent in conflict-ridden environments, the exhaustion that goes beyond the physical, that seems to settle somewhere deeper than the muscles. All of that is the field responding. It's the human energy system processing frequencies that entered through a door most people don't even know exists. The most disturbing aspect of this reality is this: the subconscious does not distinguish between what is yours and what belongs to the environment. It doesn't have that filter. To the subconscious, a frequency that enters repeatedly is a frequency that belongs to the system. It's identity, it's normal, it's what deserves to be there. So, a person who spends years in emotionally chaotic environments, who lives around people vibrating at frequencies of fear, anger, or scarcity, who daily consumes content that activates anxiety and urgency, that person is not merely being influenced externally. They are, little by little, being reprogrammed. The field that should be theirs begins to carry frequencies that were never theirs, and the subconscious begins to treat them as if they were. You are not just feeling the environment. At a level far deeper than feels comfortable to admit, you are becoming it. And what makes this process so silent, so difficult to identify while it's happening, is that it has no specific moment of onset. There's no dramatic turning point. It happens gradually, one exposure after another, one absorption after another, until the person looks at their own life and no longer recognizes how they got to where they are, doesn't recognize the patterns, doesn't recognize the reactions, doesn't recognize the frequency they're emitting, and they think that's who they are, when in reality it's simply what they absorbed. Understanding that the field exists is the first step, but understanding the field without understanding the mechanism that governs it is like knowing the heart exists without understanding how it works. You have the information, but it still doesn't protect you. And it's exactly the mechanism, the internal process, that determines whether the field is open or closed to external influences, that Bentov went searching for with measuring instruments in a laboratory with real data produced by real people in real states of consciousness. The great breakthrough in his work wasn't discovering that the field exists. Others had come close to that before. The great breakthrough was understanding that the field has states, that it doesn't always operate the same way, with the same permeability, with the same openness to what comes from outside, and that those states are not random. They don't depend on the luck of the day, don't depend on mood, don't depend on uncontrollable external factors. They depend on something that happens within the human system itself, something that can be identified, studied, and most importantly, deliberately activated. What he identified through measurements taken of people in deep states of meditation was a specific phenomenon that became known as coherence. Coherence is not relaxation. It's not simply the absence of stress or the feeling of being calm. Coherence is a precise physiological state where heart rate, breathing, and brain waves fall into sync, where the different systems of the body stop operating at conflicting frequencies and begin to oscillate in harmony, like musicians in an orchestra who have finally found the same beat. And in that state, something happens to the field around the body that changes everything. The field expands, it strengthens, and its permeability changes radically. The low coherence external frequencies, the emotional chaos of the environment, the energies of fear and conflict that circulate nearby, the constant informational noise of the modern world, stop penetrating the system with the same ease. Not because the field closes itself aggressively, like armor, but because a field in high coherence simply does not resonate with low coherence frequencies. Physics is direct on this point. Systems at distinct frequencies don't couple easily. A strong, coherent field is not invaded by weak, disordered frequencies. They simply find no point of entry. The detail he recorded, one that carries enormous weight for anyone who understands what it means, is that this state of coherence is not a spiritual achievement reserved for monks or the enlightened. It is the natural state of the human being. It is the state the system was designed for. What happened over decades of modern life, of constant urgency, chronic fear, reactivity as the default mode of existence, was a progressive departure from this natural state. People are not in disorder because they are weak or because something is wrong with them. They are in disorder because they were systematically trained for it, by environments that reward reactivity, by cultures that normalize anxiety, by a lifestyle that treats stress as a sign of productivity. What the measurements showed consistently is that returning to coherence does not require years of monastic practice. It requires an understanding of how the system works and a deliberate, albeit simple practice of recalibration. People with no prior meditation experience could reach measurable states of coherence in a relatively short time when guided to focus on specific points of the body, especially the region of the heart, and to intentionally sustain elevated emotional states. The field responded. The instruments recorded it. The data was clear. But there is a layer within this mechanism that goes beyond meditation itself, and that is fundamental to understand, so that vibrational protection works not only during the practice, but throughout the entire day. Because the state of coherence reached in a meditation session begins to dissolve as soon as the person returns to a high disorder environment without any active awareness of what is happening to their field. The world around them doesn't wait. Frequencies don't ask for permission. And without understanding where they enter, any recalibration work has a very short shelf life. That's where the question shifts direction. The question is no longer just, how do I achieve coherence, but rather, what specifically is destroying coherence throughout the day? Where do low-frequency energies find their way into the system, and what are the doors that stay open without the person even realizing they opened them? Every structure has vulnerable points. Every system has entry points. And the human energy field is no different. It has specific doors through which external low-coherence frequencies find their way in, And most people keep those doors completely open for practically the entire day, with no awareness that this is happening. Not out of carelessness, not out of weakness. Simply because no one ever pointed out where those doors are. And what you can't see, you can't close. The first door is attention. Not in the vague sense of focus, but in the literal sense of directing energy. Human attention is not passive. It is a beam of energy that, repeatedly aimed in a given direction, tunes the entire field to that frequency. Every time the mind compulsively returns to what went wrong, to what hurt, to what might go wrong, to what others think, to what is beyond control, the entire field enters resonance with those frequencies. And a field in resonance with scarcity, with fear, with anticipation of harm, begins to organize the perception of reality around those frequencies. Not because life is objectively bad, but because the perception system has been tuned to see exactly what confirms what the field is already emitting. Attention, when it's not under conscious control, is the most constantly open door of all. The second door is the body, and this is the door people most frequently ignore, because the body seems to be merely the vehicle, the vessel of consciousness, not the field itself. But the body is an archive. It registers every frequency that passed through the system over an entire lifetime, and it stores them in the form of muscular tension, breathing patterns, posture, micro-expressions that occur below the threshold of conscious perception. A chronically constricted chest, permanently raised shoulders, short and shallow breathing that never reaches the abdomen, all of these are physical records of a field that went through threatening situations and never completed the discharge cycle. The body doesn't forget. And as long as those physical patterns remain, they function as antennas tuned to alert frequencies, continuously transmitting to the nervous system the message that danger is still present, even when the external environment is completely safe. The field cannot expand in a body that is still in survival mode. The third door is the deepest, the most difficult to identify, and without question, the most dangerous of all, because it operates at the most silent level of the human system. That door is identity. Not the identity the person consciously declares, not what they say about themselves in conversations or on social media. The identity that is engraved in the subconscious, shaped by decades of experiences, by messages received, by interpretations that were made about what those experiences meant about who they are. When at the deepest level of the system there is an installed belief that one is someone who suffers, who doesn't deserve, who always gets close but never quite reaches, who the world has no room for in terms of prosperity, that belief is not just a negative thought. It is a radio signal, a constant, uninterrupted signal that the field emits 24 hours a day, organizing perception, decisions, and interactions in such a way that external reality is gradually built to confirm exactly what the system believes to be true about itself. These three doors operate simultaneously, feeding off one another in a way that makes the cycle self-sustaining. Fragmented attention fuels tension in the body. Tension in the body confirms the state of alert in the nervous system. The state of alert reinforces scarcity and threat-based identity beliefs, and those identity beliefs direct attention back toward whatever confirms them. A closed loop, invisible to the person inside it, spinning indefinitely until it is deliberately and consciously interrupted. What makes this cycle particularly difficult to break isn't its strength. It's its familiarity. Frequencies repeated long enough stop feeling like external frequencies and start feeling like personality. They start feeling like who the person is rather than what the environment did to them. And it is far harder to question what you believe you are than to question what came from outside. That's why most people try to change behaviors, change habits, change external circumstances, without touching the doors. And the results are temporary because the underlying structure organizing the experience remains intact. Closing these doors is not an act of willpower. It is a protocol, a precise sequence of movements that recalibrates the system from the inside out, starting exactly at the point where change needs to happen for everything else to move along with it. Protecting your vibration is not a passive act. It's not avoiding difficult people. It's not isolating yourself from the world. It's not repeating positive affirmations in front of the mirror every morning. It is an active protocol, a sequence of movements that recalibrates the field from the inside out, and that needs to be practiced with the same seriousness with which one practices any skill that genuinely matters. The first movement is what can be called a coherence anchor. A daily moment, preferably right upon waking, before the noise of the day begins to pour in, where the system is intentionally brought into sync. Slow, conscious breathing, attention directed to the center of the chest, and an elevated emotion sustained for at least 90 seconds. Not manufactured feeling, not an internal performance. Real emotion, generated from the inside out, not depending on any external circumstance to exist. Genuine gratitude for something concrete. The real feeling of safety or love, any elevated frequency the system can access authentically. 90 seconds may seem like very little, but what happens in the field during that time, when the practice is consistent, is cumulative. Each session leaves a trace, and that trace gradually becomes the system's baseline state. The second movement is vigilance over the return point. Throughout the day, the field will be pulled. A conversation that activates reactivity, a piece of news that plants anxiety, an environment that drains without asking. These pulls are inevitable. The point was never to eliminate them. The point is how long it takes to notice you've left your frequency and return to it. Because every return is training. Every time awareness identifies the departure and consciously chooses to come back to the state of coherence, the field grows a little stronger. The ability to sustain it increases. Recovery time decreases. Over time, what once took hours to process begins to be processed in minutes. Not because external challenges have diminished, but because the internal system has grown more robust. The third movement is the most counterintuitive of the three, and perhaps the most underestimated. Intentional exposure to beauty. Music that moves you, nature that brings stillness, art that opens something inside, gratitude directed toward what is real and concrete in your life. Beauty is not an emotional luxury. It is one of the highest frequencies the human system is capable of processing, and high frequency does not coexist with low frequency. One displaces the other. Not because beauty is stronger in an aggressive sense, but because it raises the baseline state of the field to a point where low coherence frequencies simply find no surface to anchor onto. These three movements together are not a spiritual practice in the religious sense. They are field engineering. They are the conscious use of knowledge about how the human energy system works to produce a specific and verifiable result. A more coherent, more stable, more resilient field in the face of what the environment tries to impose. And the effects of this in real life are what anyone who has never heard of Bentov would simply describe as an inexplicable transformation. The transformation that begins to unfold with consistent practice of the protocol is not dramatic. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. There's no specific moment where everything changes at once. It settles in silently, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. And it's exactly because of that many people underestimate what is happening to them until someone on the outside points it out. Until a friend asks what changed. Until they realize that situations that used to destroy them emotionally are now being processed with a lightness they can't quite explain. The people around you change their behavior. Not because they have changed, but because the field you now emit is different. And different fields provoke different responses in the people around you. Environments that used to drain you begin to affect you less. Situations that once took days to digest internally start resolving faster. And opportunities that once went completely invisible begin to appear with a frequency that initially seems like coincidence, until the coincidences become too numerous to keep treating as such. This doesn't happen because the external world changed. The world remains exactly the same, with the same amount of chaos, unpredictability, and low coherence frequencies circulating in every environment. What changed was the signal the system is emitting, and a different signal organizes an entirely different experience of the same reality. There is a point in this journey that is difficult to describe without sounding mystical, but which has a direct physical explanation. It is the moment when the practice stops being a conscious effort and becomes the baseline state of the system. The moment when maintaining field coherence stops requiring deliberate attention and simply becomes the way the organism operates by default. This point doesn't happen overnight. It happens after weeks, sometimes months, of repeated returns, of daily anchoring, of intentional exposure to elevated frequencies. But when it does happen, the shift in the quality of life experience is so substantial that the person finds themselves wondering how they lived so long without this understanding. Bentov described the conscious human being as a transmitter, not a receiver that reacts to what the world emits, but a transmitter that proposes a frequency to the world and watches reality reorganize itself around that frequency. Most people spend their entire lives in receiver mode, absorbing everything the environment emits, being shaped by frequencies they never chose, building an entire life on top of a field that was never truly theirs, believing that what they feel is who they are, when in reality it is simply what they absorbed without realizing it. The shift happens at the moment a person stops asking, "Why is my life like this?" and starts asking, "What frequency am I emitting that organizes my life this way?" Because the second question has an answer, and the answer has a solution. Not a magical solution, not a promise that everything will be perfect, but a real, verifiable change, felt first on the inside and then reflected with growing clarity in the external world. The system stops responding to the world and begins to propose to it, stops being shaped and begins to shape. This turning point is no one's privilege. It is not a spiritual gift, not luck, not the result of a difficulty-free life or a trauma-free past. It is the direct and predictable result of someone who understood how the field works and decided, consciously and consistently, to stop leaving their own frequency in the hands of chance. The question that remains, and that each person must answer for themselves, is simple and direct. How much longer are you going to keep letting the world write your frequency? Everything presented here is not abstract theory. It's not philosophy to be admired from a distance and forgotten as soon as the video ends. It's a map, and maps are only useful to those who decide to move. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this was just a starting point. There is much more being explored here, with the same depth, the same foundation, and the same commitment to knowledge that genuinely transforms.